Okay, here we are. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to a contemplative conversation. And this one is called Transferring Turmoil, Exploring Anxiety and Trauma in Meditation Practice. And this conversation is hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne, along with their partner, Cheetah House. Now, my name is Tom Tilley. I'm a journalist by trade and the moderator for today's event. And I'd like to start by paying an acknowledgement to the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which Melbourne University sits. I'd also like to pay respects to elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous people present for this event. Now, this is a really interesting conversation because in the wake of the mindfulness explosion over the last decade, is a growing awareness and understanding about the potential harms of the practice that is now so ubiquitous. Now, our goal here today is to learn about the latest developments in the critical evaluation of mindfulness and meditation and learn how to minimize its potential harm. Now, one of those developments we'll talk about today is a fascinating study about the ineffectiveness of mindfulness in our schools, and also the establishment of the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne, the host of this event, and the new partnership between the centre and Cheetah House. Now, we'd love to have your questions as part of the event, so please submit as many of those. You'll see in the little box below Q&A. That's where you can submit your questions, and we'll try and weave them into the discussion as much as possible. It's a lot more fun when these sessions are interactive, so please get involved with your questions. No question too simple. It could be exactly what someone else was thinking. If you want to submit your question anonymously, that is absolutely fine as well. And there will be a recording made of this event publicly soon after it is finished. All right, we have three really interesting guests. We have two of the world's leading academics in the evaluation of mindfulness and meditation. And we also have an academic that's sharing a personal story of a harrowing experience with mindfulness and meditation. Now, instead of me telling you all about them, I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Associate Professor Nicholas Van Dam. He's the inaugural director of the Contemplative Studies Centre. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us and being part of this. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you've done in this space.
Thanks, Tom. I'm Nicholas Van Dam. I'm the director of the Contemplative Studies Centre here at the University of Melbourne. And this is an area for me that has been a passion for quite some time. I've done research on the way in which we measure and understand mindfulness. I've also done work exploring the extent to which mindfulness-based programs work. And increasingly, I've been looking at ways in which different forms or versions of mindfulness programs might be helpful. So things like apps versus in-person programs and various other ways. So, and one of my core issues or interests is this idea of how we're using mindfulness and meditation more broadly, where it can help, where it may be ineffective or useless, I guess, and where it may actually harm. So that's something I'm hoping we'll get into in the discussion today.
Excellent. All right, now we'll go to Dr. Willoughby Britton. She's the founder of Cheetah House and the director of Brown University's Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. Willoughby, I'll let you introduce yourself in more detail. Tell us, what is the sort of key area of your focus, and why did this area become a key focus for you?
Yeah, so I study meditation, broadly speaking, its effects on the body and brain in a range of different types of contexts, clinical contexts, religious contexts. And, we see just a broad range of different effects across the board. And so that was the first thing that I was interested in, was just that there are a lot of different effects besides the ones that we hear about in sort of the health and medicine. There's a lot of other ones too, not necessarily adverse, just a lot of different kinds of effects. So that was the first thing. And I also study, the why certain treatments work for certain people and not for others. So that, that's called moderators of treatment outcome. And so I'm also really interested in different types of practices. because meditation is not just one thing, it's many different practices. And so I think for it to be the most helpful, it would be about matching the right practice with the right person. If you mismatch, then things can go wrong. If you overtrain certain types of capacities, then things can go wrong. And so that was sort of my initial orientation to this. And then we did a study called the Varieties of Contemplative Experience study, which was really just asking meditation teachers, like, what kind of challenges have you seen observed in your own students? And when we published that study, we got calls from all over the world from meditators in distress. So many, in fact, that I had to start this nonprofit called Cheetah House. And so it made me realize, wow, there's a lot of things, there's something that we're not really tapping into as researchers. There's a bigger phenomenon here. A lot of people are having trouble with meditation, and we just had no idea.
Yeah, and I'll be really interested to find out more about the work you're doing with those practitioners and the way you're helping them basically try and minimize the harms of when that mismatch you discussed earlier isn't right. As we introduce ourselves, I will tell you a little bit more about myself, because I actually wrote a book last year about growing up in a fundamentalist Pentecostal church. And it was very interesting when I looked into this area. I noticed there were some very surprising similarities in some of the cult-like behavior I'd seen in the mindfulness movement as to the sort of behavior and group thinking in the church. So that might come up a little bit later as well. Our third guest is Professor Andrew Perfors, and he's the director of the Complex Human Data Hub at the University of Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. But Andrew is not here so much to discuss his academic work as his personal story. Andrew, let's get into your personal story. Tell us about your experience with mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah. So, I don't know how much I should go in at this moment, but yeah, I'm a professor of cognitive science studying stuff that is not mindfulness at all. I build computational models of how people think and pass information around. But yeah, I'm here because a few years back I had a really, as you say, harrowing kind of experience with mindfulness, which Nicholas knew about and invited me to share. And, you know, both as a cognitive scientist, I'm really interested in understanding what the heck happened and what went wrong. And also just as a person, I would have found it useful before embarking on trying to make mindfulness work for me. I would have found it useful to know that this kind of thing was possible. Yeah, do you want me to go into it? Or, yeah.
Let's go right into your story. Tell us what drew you into mindfulness, and how did it surprise you on the downside?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what drew me into mindfulness is probably what draws a lot of people. Like, so, you know, this was about 4 or 5 years ago. I was coming off a sort of, you know, or I was very, very stressful job, 2 small children, not enough sleep, and feeling like, you know, my stress was just getting the better of me, and I had to sort of start building in, you know, a better way to deal with it and more exercise. And so I was like, I know, I'll take a weekly yoga class, and that was literally all it was. And at first, my first part of the yoga class had an instructor who was all yoga, no mindfulness. So it was just literally physical. And then it changed and it became an instructor who was very much part of the mindfulness thing. And I found soon after that, like, you know, I was really starting to feel kind of distressed and weirdly depersonalized after it, you know, because of all the sort of, you sit around in yoga and like think about where your body is, and I don't know, like sort of mindfulness type things. But there was also this sort of, and I realized it was mindfulness, and I was like, but this is probably good for me, right? And so I'll sort of, and that's what everyone says, stick it through. And so I did this for a few months, just weekly yoga. And every time I started, you know, feeling more and more distressed and getting harder to go, just because of feeling like, just, it's hard to explain, like depersonalized, like I wasn't me during or slightly after. And then I had this one experience in class where, you know, again, it was sort of, you know, create a little garden in your mind and think your thoughts and figure out where your body is. And I just felt like I was sort of rising above myself, and I started crying. And I never cry. Like I've cried maybe like 8 times in my life or something. And I was just sort of silent crying. But I was looking down on myself crying, and I was like, why am I crying? What the fuck is, sorry, what is going on? And, and I just sort of lasted that way through the whole class. And the instructor sort of noticed, and I was just like, and I just could not, and finally I sort of gathered myself and went home, and I was like, okay, I'm just not doing that again. And I felt really weird. And then over the next few weeks, I wasn't in yoga, and I had a few more of these sort of, rising strong dissociative episodes. And then basically after that, I had a year of absolute hell, of like, insomnia, 4 hours a night of sleep. And essentially the thing was that, this is retrospect, I had a lot of stuff I was hiding from myself and not willing to deal with. And basically it sort of unearthed all that stuff, and I wasn't able to deal with it, like in a time, in a place that was not safe and everything. And, I ended up, going to therapy, lots and lots of therapy, realized part of the stuff was realizing that I was trans and sort of dealing with that. But, essentially, had I not had a lot of the resources I have to go to therapy, to trust myself, to, take some time off work when I needed to, like very understanding partner and friends, it could have been a lot worse. And as it was very much one of the worst years of my life, several bad years. And yeah, so
Wow.
Obviously meditation didn't cause it. Well, the stuff was there, but yeah.
How long, if I could ask a question there, how long was the period between this practice unearthing these really dissociating feelings for you and then you getting the help you needed? You've talked about a bad year. Was there quite a period there where you weren't getting any help and it got very dark?
There were a couple of months where it was very dark, and it was only 2 months or so, because I realized fairly quickly, again, something is really wrong, But then, of course, there's the who do I ask, get on waiting lists, blah, 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 and I did, like the other thing is when things are dark, and you're flailing, and I was trying my best to hold it together for my kids and my job, but like it was getting increasingly frayed, like you don't make really great decisions, and so, yeah, so I would say there's a few months before therapy, but it actually took probably a good, I don't know, 6 months to a year of therapy to sort of get at part of the heart of it, and probably 2 years. I mean, I'm still in therapy to give you a sense, although that's not dealing with the meditation stuff, that's dealing with the stuff that it unearthed, but probably 6 months to a year in therapy to sort of start making any sense of it. Because of course you need to build a trusting relationship with a therapist. You need to untangle all the things. Yeah. So it was not simple.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing such a painful part of your life with us, Andrew. Can you break it down a little bit more about the process of how, you go from yoga into a sort of meditation practice, and then how, with the benefit of hindsight and probably the therapy and the greater understanding you have about that now, can you pick apart how that practice unearthed these really confusing feelings for you?
So I'll tell you what I think is going on with me. And I think there's actually general, like, it's not just, I think, for trans people that this happens. So, but for me, it was very, very much so growing up trans, as I did when I was, this is the 80s, 90s, you learn very quick, this is not a thing, you don't have words for it. And so I dealt with that by essentially dissociating just as a sort of matter of course. You cut yourself off from your body, more or less, because that's also part of the source of the painful things. And so that was just kind of my basic state. That was my coping mechanism. And so like, I knew things distressed me, but not that bad, because I cut off myself from my emotions really well. When I say I'd never cried, that's not a mistake. Like I was just very, very good at just cutting. And so meditation breaks that cut, right? Meditation is all about feel your body, feel your thoughts, feel your feelings. So I was just like breaking this lifetime of my only coping mechanism. And, it succeeded in breaking it enough that like it just shattered. And I suspect that, people who have other coping mechanisms, meditation is powerful. That's why it's good, but like if you have a coping mechanism for something and there's usually a reason for it. And if you've not sort of made it so you don't need that coping mechanism anymore, then breaking it is sort of, like breaking you. So I feel like that's kind of, in hindsight, that's totally what happened. Like I just, it was destined. It's designed to make you get in touch with your feelings in your body. And it turns out my feelings in my body were telling me things I did not want to hear, and was not able to hear. Yeah.
Willoughby, I'd like to bring you in. What's coming to your mind as you hear Andrew's story, and how do his experiences connect with the broader research you've done?
Yeah, so Andy's story for sure is one I've heard many times before. I'm also really sorry that happened to you, Andy. It's always terrible, but I'm glad that you're better. I mean, I think we see a wide range of different types of difficulties. And I think some of the most common ones are things that Andy mentioned. So, and I kind of describe them as forms of dysregulated arousal, so hyperarousal and dissociation. And I can break those down. Hyperarousal are things like just having too much awareness, like you can't turn off being aware of everything, which sounds like a good thing, but when it happens, it's not. Perceptual hypersensitivity, so being super sensitive to light and sound. Again, you're training that, right? You're trying to attend to things, but like you can kind of increase the sensitivity of your system. And there can be some agitation, anxiety, everything on the sort of fear spectrum, panic, terror, insomnia, which you mentioned. And then this flooding, this emotional flooding. So re-experiencing of traumatic memories is very common, and it can come with, sometimes it's memories and sometimes it's just emotion. But a lot of people are like, there's probably a trauma there, but I just don't remember it, but it's just pure emotion. That's called affect without recollection. There can be rage. There can also be involuntary movement. So people have like twitches or their faces twitch, sometimes even convulsions. So those are like sort of signs of hyperarousal. And then when the system gets sort of overloaded with, becomes too sensitive, it kind of has its own breaker. And this is from a trauma perspective, which would be dissociation. So with dissociation, you see things like emotional blunting, feeling emotionally flat or numb, loss of all emotions, feeling disconnected from your loved ones, anhedonia, which is not enjoying things you used to enjoy, having no motivation. And then, Andy also mentioned, actually my specialty, which is changes in sense of self, which is related to dissociation. So you can feel like you don't exist at all. I have people that feel like if they had a glass of water and they poured it into their mouth, that they would look behind them to see if it fell on the floor, because they don't feel like they're here anymore. You can feel like you're outside your body, or watching yourself like a fly on the wall, or like a camera, or you're like in a movie. It's a very weird sensation. Those are all dissociation symptoms. And then this feeling of not being real or dreamlike, so he mentioned the word depersonalization. That's like classic depersonalization, but it's also in some ways, it's a capacity that we have to protect ourselves from overwhelming trauma, which he's been using very well, right? But it's also a really strange experience. And if you don't know what it is, you can really go down the rabbit hole of being really terrified by this experience, because it is an altered state to be depersonalized. And unfortunately, and this is actually what I specialize in, is that people can become afraid of being depersonalized. And because depersonalization is itself a protection against fear, it can keep it going for a long time. And so people can actually be depersonalized for years. And so you really want to have, there's also, and you were very lucky, I don't know if your doctor diagnosed you with depersonalization, but it's not, clinicians are not trained in it. And so you're very likely to get misdiagnosed. And so the likelihood of the time that it takes to get a correct diagnosis for depersonalization is, I think, 12 years. So you got, I don't know what your
Yeah,
doctor
I didn't
said,
get,
but
yeah,
you can
I
really,
did
you
get
can get
diagnosed,
diagnosed
but
with
it was
schizophrenia, and
yeah, no, thank God, no. And I think, again, being a professor of psychology helped me a lot, because I could come and use all these words with my therapist and say, I think this, yeah. So no, I managed to avoid bad diagnoses, but as also, I think I avoided that bad cycle you talked about, which is, I think where it feeds on itself. Again, this was my benefit of having a lot of knowledge, even though I don't study this, to sort of fall back on and be like, okay, I can explain this. And yeah.
It's interesting, as the only non-academic in the conversation, some of these words like dissociation or depersonalization, I don't have a true understanding of what they mean, and they do feel a little bit academic in a sense when we're talking about such, you used the word a moment ago, Willoughby, terrifying, and you talked about fear. What's the emotional journey of this?
So, I mean, I think I can't really stress enough the individual variability. So everybody's story is different. And, but I do very often see a combination of intense anxiety and fearfulness. I mean, to the extent that people end up in the emergency room because they're not sleeping, they're that afraid. Or they lose like a significant amount of weight because they are unable to eat. They're that afraid, like really, really terrified kind of level of fear. And our bodies are not, our bodies have a natural sort of shut off switch when that happens. And it basically turns down the fear dramatically. It turns down our emotional system and our brain dramatically. And so it's a response to fear. And it happens to be, I mean, the other part of my research is doing, what are the neural correlates of meditation? And if you look at the neural correlates of meditation, which are, strong prefrontal cortex activation and a downregulation of the limbic system, that's pretty much exactly the same as dissociation, depersonalization. So there's going to be a natural overlap neurally anyway. The meditation has a very, very similar neural profile to dissociation. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted
Is
to
that
add,
better? Probably not if I went into the prefrontal cortex, but.
No, it all helps.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to add, this sounds so much like my experience, but that from my end, so I lost probably 30% of my body weight that year. Like, I just could not eat. And I also probably vomited almost daily, and, and the insomnia. And,
Wow.
and it was also, I was, dissociated to the extent that I wasn't actually feeling that much overwhelming fear and trauma. Mostly I was just so like, this is not right. What is happening to me? Like, that was actually my overwhelming memory of that year, is just, distressed when I could feel it, but mainly like, I do not understand, everything is breaking. And, yeah. So
Wow.
I just wanted to say, not in any way to diminish Andy's experience, because certainly the example that I might give is in no way likely to resonate sort of with Andy per se. But I mean, a lot of people, I think, might be able to understand some part of this experience by just thinking about, say, public speaking. And so the example that comes to mind for me is, as a young child, growing up in a Christian school, I had to give the message to my school of 800 students. And so I was asked to stand up and speak in front of 800 students. And, as a young person who is relatively inclined towards anxiety, that was pretty terrifying. And so my body's coping mechanism was essentially that I sort of felt a bit distant from myself. So the words, as I was sort of up there at the lectern speaking, I was saying the words, but it sort of felt as if I wasn't fully in my body. I was sort of kind of watching myself speaking. And so I think there is an element of things like that you can imagine, when you're doing something that really scares you, like terrifies you, and public speaking is an example that a lot of people can resonate with, getting up in front of a large audience and speaking, it's the kind of thing that really, really scares you. And so you can start to feel those threads of how one of the ways that you kind of protect yourself, or it's very automatic. You don't necessarily do this on purpose, but you start to feel as if you're not really there. As Willoughby sort of suggested, it can be a protective mechanism. The body and kind of goes into autopilot and it kind of just does its thing, and you feel like whoever you are, wherever you are, if you're still there, you're kind of watching from a distance.
So another interesting part of your story, Andy, was the way it started, that you were at a yoga class that then drifted into meditation. And I think that highlights how it's seen as so harmless and such low risk that you would so easily slide into it without any pre-screening about someone's psychological condition. So let's go back a little bit, and maybe, Nicholas, you can help us chart the journey of the mindfulness movement. When did it really take off, and how far has it come in the last 2 decades?
Yes, I mean, the origins of mindfulness go back quite a long ways. And this is something sort of that is, commonly marketed. When people talk about the mindfulness practice that they offer, they kind of love to say people have been doing these kinds of practices for, 2,000, to 3,000 years, right? And so there's a sense of this does go back a really long way. Certain versions of the practices that we talk about in mindfulness are inspired by traditions like Buddhism. Arguably, however, kinds of the versions that you see today contemporarily, the kinds of things that Andy's talking about, doing body and mind exploration in the context of a yoga class, likely bears very little resemblance, if any, to kind of what happened, 2,500 years ago. But so that's kind of where this, the kind of really long history of it, really, and as Willoughby could attest to, sort of there was a huge movement in the sort of 60s and 70s to really popularize the idea of meditation more broadly. But that was really in the context of transcendental meditation. So for people that can remember back to that era, or were around at that era, the kind of enthusiasm, among people like the Beatles, and sort of, emphasizing that, that you need to get engaged with mantras, it became very popular. Ultimately, that particular movement crashed a little bit, largely, I think, because the way in which it was being promoted and popularized, and the way in which scientists were looking at it, didn't match up. So what happened sort of is that some popular papers got published in some really big journals. The scientists and other people said, cool, what are the methods? And the big proponents of that particular form of meditation said, you have to come and pay the money to do our courses, and then we'll tell you what the magic is. And so, people just went, well, that's not exactly how we do things in science, so we're not interested in that. So it kind of then fell under the radar for quite a while. And it really kind of died out pretty quickly. Now, TM research and things like that's still happening, but it really wasn't until the kind of mid-2000s that mindfulness started to take off again. And about that time, you had a number of things happening. You had the first mindfulness meditation app come on board. So I think Headspace was first kind of made available around 2004 or so. You had this organization called Mind and Life that kind of really became quite active and started to get together Buddhists and other contemplative or meditation practitioners. And you had scientists sort of starting to really study this thing again. You had programs like mindfulness-based stress reduction become sort of things that were promoted and emphasized. And you had big, huge events with neuroscientists, with Buddhist monks, with popular kind of figures in the public like Jon Kabat-Zinn, and you had people on popular television on specials really emphasizing these ideas. Now, in the past 2 decades, it's gone a lot further, and I think the whole idea of, well, what is mindfulness and what is meditation has gotten messier, and the boundaries and the ideas about, well, who can offer this? What does it look like? What do you need to do? This whole industry has kind of taken over in some senses. And I often talk about the fact that mindfulness and meditation are often kind of seen as part of the wellness industry, which is an industry that's worth about $4.5 trillion US. Wow. And meditation is about, depends on the estimations you look at, but it's a few billion US dollars of that. So there's a whole massive industry here. And this spans everything from, retreats to self-help books to, sound baths to tools and things you want, to guided meditations to apps. And so what we see now, what we see being offered, is kind of all over the shop, and so what you hear Andy talking about in terms of his experience kind of, doing something like meditation or mindfulness is something that is not uncommon. People sort of feel like, oh, I've heard about this mindfulness thing. It's supposed to be good, right? But I guess the interesting thing is that what Andy was exposed to and encountering was likely very different from the thing that we've actually studied and we know quite a lot about. And that's an important point as well. So the way in which this idea has become really popular is quite messy. And we're not very specific about what mindfulness is or what meditation is. And so that kind of allows a lot of room for people to come in and basically say, I do that. I do mindfulness, come and buy my product. And that presents a real challenge.
Well, it's incredible how widely it's infiltrated very mainstream parts of our society now. And I love, Willoughby, for you to explain the reach of it a bit more now that we see it in schools, now often as part of our mental health toolkit that a psychologist might, talk to a patient about. Mindfulness is part of this suite of preventative measures that is commonly talked about. It's even talked about in workplaces, not to mention the widespread use via smartphone apps. So, coming from a religious tradition to such a broad use in a secular context is a huge journey. Can you shed a bit more light on its reach and how much it's been taken up across different sectors of society?
I mean, I teach a class at Brown called Meditation in the Brain, and it's not about the neuroscience of meditation as much as that exact question, which is, how did this practice that has, religious origins and has a goal of enlightenment, how did that become wedded to and part of neuroscience and medicine and clinical psychology? Like, that's not where it was situated 2,000 years ago. And so, our students only know what they see now, but it's actually kind of weird that is the case. So yeah, I mean, meditation and mindfulness is being used in, like you said, schools, prisons, businesses. I see it a lot as a way of kind of addressing the healthcare cost crisis, especially in the UK, where we'll just have everyone do mindfulness and take responsibility for their own wellness. And if they don't get better, then they didn't do enough of it, and sort of punt the responsibility to the person. And so I see it being kind of used that way. And it's like become the default for a lot of clinicians. Like, so many people that come to Cheetah House, like, they can't go to a doctor or even a regular therapist anymore because they are always prescribing meditation. Some of the people who ended up in the psychiatric wards in the hospital because of meditation, they left, they had a psychotic break from a meditation retreat. They go to the psych ward and they're teaching meditation at the psych ward. And so, yeah, it is like literally everywhere. Yeah, Andy.
I just wanted to add that I feel like this is actually one of the most pernicious things about it, because it is obviously good for many people. And if it just sort of stopped at that'd be fine. But there's this very strong message that if it's not working for you, you're not doing it right, or you're not doing enough of it. And so it's this complete mind fuck where, then you start overthinking that, and you're trying to get into your thoughts and not judge them, but at the same time, it's not working, and then you judge yourself for and it's just, and I feel like a lot of the damage came because I went much longer than I should have because of this general message that if it's not working, keep at it or try harder. And
I think this is what Andy just said, like the religious history and the multi-billion-dollar market agenda are playing a role here, because if your religious tradition and your bottom line are putting pressure on you to you can't knock the product. Your product has to be perfect. You can't say like, oh, you should do less of our product. That's not good business. And it's also not good religion.
Yeah.
And so the answer is always going to be more, you need to do more of our product, which is exactly what Purdue Pharma did, by the way. So it's a known brand defense strategy to say, like, you just need to do more of our product if you're having problems. But And that is the party line, and that is what people are doing. And the people that I see that end up at Cheetah House, like, we're told by many different species of authorities, meditation teachers, doctors, clinicians, psychiatrists, to meditate more. And they did, and they got worse, a lot worse. And so I think that if there's going to be one take-home message today, is if it's not working for you, like, stop and do something else that is, and more is not better. Yeah.
It's that part of your story, Andrew, that really connected to me, or the young Tom as a boy, where the focus of my church and what was so unique about it was this focus on speaking in tongues. And so our church had this unique belief that if you didn't speak in tongues, you weren't saved. It's kind of a very hardcore Pentecostal extreme. And so as a kid, I was in this rooms, and there was all this group behavior and group think. And if you hadn't had this experience, come into your body from God, then you just had to be more humble. You just had to keep seeking for this experience. You just had to open your heart. And so you're there as a boy thinking, well, there must be something wrong with me. Do I have evil thoughts? Am I selfish? Or all this painful self-questioning. So it was a real light bulb moment for me hearing you describe that experience in this context. Because again, it's that big group think that, oh, it's so simple and harmless. How could it be going wrong here? Oh, the only part of the equation where the question mark lies is me.
Yeah, it's really funny that you say that, because I was also raised religious, but not nearly the Pentecostal extreme. But similarly, the same sort of, I don't believe in God, something must be wrong with me. And there's layers too, because of course that's also what it's like growing up trans, especially back then. There were not even words, and like, there's something wrong with me. And so, like, sitting there in the yoga and thinking, this is working for everyone, why isn't it working for me? There's something, and it dug up layers and layers and layers of this sort of, something is wrong with me kind of thing. And that was actually part of the trauma it was unearthing, as it was also adding in the exact same way. And so I feel like, again, that, the details probably vary across people, but many of us have had that sort of experience of second guessing, something is wrong with me, therefore, I am bad, and I'll do what people say because I don't know what else, while sort of knowing that it was not right. But yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say this is a pattern that we see a lot, which is there's sort of the primary symptoms, the ones that are directly caused by the practice. And then we see these secondary symptoms that are caused by the way people are reacting to us saying, hey, I'm having problems with meditation, because there are a set of party lines, and they're all along the lines of victim blaming. So, it wasn't the meditation. You had a pre-existing condition. You have a trauma history, you have all sorts of things wrong with you, Andy, like, it wasn't the meditation. So that's like number one, is there's a pre-existing condition. This is also used by the tobacco industry and all the other ones. So very well, good brand defense strategy. Second one is user error. You did it wrong. You didn't know, you did it wrong. You had the wrong teacher. You weren't adequately prepared. And these are the kinds of things. And so one thing that I wanted to make sure that gets on the record is that we are seeing, in the study that we did, the varieties of contemplative experience study, we looked at all these factors, and we actually found plenty of people who got into trouble with meditation under optimal conditions. And they were meditation teachers themselves. They were meditating correctly. They did not have a psychiatric history. They did not have a trauma history. So yes, those things play a role for sure, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't the meditation practice. So just want to make sure that that's clear.
Yeah, we've got a question that goes to some of these issues that are coming up now. This one is probably best to you, Willoughby. What advice would you give to someone whose psychologist keeps suggesting mindfulness meditation when it hasn't been effective and isn't addressing the treatment of their trauma? And this person also adds the point, it feels like mindfulness is more of a maintenance, ongoing practice that's better placed at the later stage of therapy.
I mean, there's a saying in, psychology, which is, treatments people don't fail treatments, treatments fail people. And so like, if a treatment isn't working for somebody, then they need to try something else. And if the therapist or the meditation teacher or whoever, doesn't understand that basic principle, then find another one, because they're not thinking about your well-being, and they obviously have an agenda or an attachment to this modality that isn't working. So, or if you feel comfortable having a frank conversation with, like, I think you're kind of overly attached to this approach and it doesn't seem to be working for me. So.
And here's a question that might be best for you, Nicholas. Can you explain why there's a distinction made between body and brain? Isn't brain part of the body? Both are physical.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated one. I think, many people have different beliefs and ideas about that one. I think it's helpful for many people intuitively to think about these things as sort of as separate, and partially that's just something that we all feel. We feel like when we feel things in our body physically, our heart, we feel a pain in parts of our body, that it sort of feels as if we can recognize that in a way that maybe is different to feeling thoughts or recognizing thoughts. So it often can feel like, well, thoughts don't exist in our body. And so some people are quite comfortable with the idea that thoughts exist in our brain. And yes, of course, the question, the point is actually true. We physically, we know that sort of the brain is part of the body, right? And if you don't understand the brain's connection and role in the body, you're missing a big part of the picture. But the third thing that where it gets really tricky is mind, right? And that's where people really kind of don't necessarily agree. Is mind fundamentally situated in the brain, or does it kind of somehow exist outside of it? And I think regardless of the answer to that, I think one thing kind of most people can agree on is that, well, there's some way in which mind has to interact with brain, and brain only survives if it's embedded within a body. So one of the things that these practices do, and for good reason, I think, hearing Andy's story and clinically, some people who are really in their heads a lot, for many of the people who are actually really helped by these practices are people who engage in a lot of worry or rumination. They get stuck thinking about all the bad things that will happen, or they spend a lot of time thinking about the stuff that happened in them in the past that didn't go well. And so getting people to be more in their bodies as opposed to like in their heads can actually, for some people, be really helpful. But I guess there are issues, and you have to be careful, because even that can go really wrong, even in psychotherapy, even sort of using best practice evidence-based approaches with someone who's really well trained. Even that kind of thing you can see the kinds of problems that Willoughby and Andy have referred to, where people can dissociate, or people can see their symptoms get worse, or people can see new symptoms emerge. And so I think all of that is important to recognize, that I think there's a number of problems here. One of which sort of the way that this is being promoted, but another one sort of is in meditation, often there's not kind of the same level of informed consent that we get with, say, psychotherapy. When you go to a psychotherapist, you want help for a particular problem, and there is a process of saying some things will come up. This will probably be difficult. This will probably be hard, and I'm going to let you know what those things are ahead of time. And if at any point this is not the way you want to go, or you feel as if you're not ready for that, we can kind of negotiate that, right? We can step back, or if you really, really don't want to do this, that's up to you. Or in other words, I guess another thing to think about is a good therapist or a good psychologist is going to say, look, if at any point it gets too severe, I'm going to probably refer you. Like, I'm going to help you get more acute, severe, kind of serious treatment than what I might be able to provide. And I think critically, while I would not necessarily say that the types of experiences that we see are fundamentally different, the big thing that is different is that process of informed consent and the container in which these experiences are happening when we talk about, say, mindfulness or meditation versus psychotherapy.
I've got an interesting question from Catherine. Is there any evidence that adverse experiences are more likely in more intensive meditations, for example, a 10-day meditation retreat?
Well, definitely. So definitely there is a correlation between the likelihood of developing difficulties with the intensity of practice. We definitely see that. I would say probably at least half of the people that I see at Cheetah House are retreatants. And there's specific kinds of retreats that are more problematic than others. But it's not 100% necessary. So there's always a caveat. Similar to, and I'm glad Andy was a good demo of that caveat, because we see people who get in trouble by using apps, 30 minutes a day or less. So yes, definitely, like the more dose, the more intense, for sure. But it's, you can also get into trouble with the low dose.
Mm.
Can I just
And
add something?
yeah,
Sorry.
sure.
I just wanted to say that one thing that I think is important to not get lost here is that also it's not sort of that you can predict ahead of time if you're going to get in trouble, because like think, oh, I don't have a trauma history, blah, blah, I'll be fine. Where like I looked on paper like I should not have had any trouble. It was just stress. I was like a professor with my life together and no apparent trauma history and all that. And so like, yeah, it's sort of, it's not just, oh, those other people, it's stress, which is what meditation is sold for. So yeah.
And I'll also say that the opposite is also true, is that people with every red flag in the book, like a history of psychosis, some family history of all sorts of things, trauma history, substance abuse, some of them actually benefit a ton from the practice. And they've also written me and said, please don't just exclude us from, getting access from the practice just because we look high risk. That's discrimination. So I also want to say that. So, I think we just need to not be making broad, sweeping statements about this. I think we need to take each case in a very, case by case basis.
And I think the important thing.
Sorry, has the research evolved to a point where you can give any sort of numerical indication on the incidence of harm from these practices?
So I wrote an entire paper about, defining and measuring adverse effects, and it's actually quite tricky to define it. But I will say that we did one study, sort of probably the most reliable estimate right now in America, is about half of all meditators who try meditation even once, so even low dose meditators, will have probably at least one meditation related adverse effect. And that could be a very transient, not a big deal. 10% will have a meditation related adverse effect that's associated with impairment in functioning. And 10% will have a meditation related adverse effect that lasts a month or longer. And so, like to go back to what Nick said, meditation is not a warm bath for the mind. You should expect some difficulty, like healing is hard, learning about yourself and your own trauma and working through that is going to be hard. So, it's probably not going to be a cakewalk. There's probably going to be some difficulty there. And so I don't call those usual kind of healing types of difficulties, I don't call those adverse effects. But when something is going to impair somebody's ability to function, or when it lasts more than a month, that's when I start to say like, that's kind of bleeding into what I would call an adverse effect.
Mm. And Nicholas, tell us more about this myriad research looking at the use of mindfulness in schools. I found that very interesting. The fact that essentially it proved it was ineffective. What can we learn from that?
Well, I think myriad is kind of a great example of what's going on in the mindfulness movement more generally. I mean, the fact that the study could even be done is quite fascinating. I mean, this was a study of 8,000 school children in the UK, and the team that did it, I mean, there were hundreds of some of the most reputable academics leading this study around the world. I mean, some of the biggest names. I think there's something like £8 million and 10 years worth of work went into this study. It was huge, they did everything they were supposed to do. In many ways, it's particularly interesting, I think, because the way in which the educators were trained to deliver this was actually pretty thorough. And many things that we compare it to in many of the mindfulness in schools programs or the mindfulness at work programs, often what you see the educators or the providers, kind of the way in which they're taught is pretty minimal. They kind of often do a series of workshops and things like that. But in this particular study, the teachers underwent the program themselves and then got really extensive training. And then they basically did a throwaway class where basically they just piloted it to make sure they could deliver it. And so after all of that, what you had, and the way they designed the study, was that students got randomized either to get standard socio-emotional learning. So this is kind of like best practice that we already use in schools for how to deal with well-being and mental health issues, or they got socio-emotional learning and then mindfulness. So that's a really interesting point that often doesn't get discussed in the context of this study. And it's, you're adding mindfulness on top of what we already do. And so what you find at the end of the day, or what they found in the study, is that not only did mindfulness show no benefit, like no benefit at all, it was no better. I mean, like there was like 3 variables where it was different. I mean, and this is in like 20 variables, right? There's basically nothing. Not only that, but on the variables where there was a difference, it went in the wrong direction. And in fact, when you look at in more detail, you find that those students or those children who had some risks of mental health issues at the outset were actually made worse off by having gotten the mindfulness. And the wrong direction I spoke of was exactly that students who got the mindfulness, on average, they tended to look a little bit worse than the students who didn't get it. So it's quite fascinating, because everybody thought going into the study, all of the studies that we had suggested this ought to work. Right? The authors were very confident that this was going to be helpful. The funding organization was very confident that this is going to be helpful. No one would spend this amount of money or this amount of time if there wasn't quite a lot of evidence suggesting this likely would be useful. And then we get this result, which suggests not only is it not useful, but maybe it's actually harmful. And so that this is something that doesn't get talked about enough.
So does that really showed that the whole practice needs a complete rethink, or given the ages of the people surveyed in that myriad study, that it's just the wrong age group to be practicing it with?
Well, I think the one thing we know in particular, sort of, and the biggest conclusions that can be made, are sort of this idea of delivering this as a universal one-size-fits-all solution. So basically going, everybody ought to do this thing. So we're going to come into a school and basically say, regardless of your interest, your history, what you're doing, how you are, you need to learn mindfulness. The biggest conclusion we can draw from the study is that doesn't work. Basically making everybody do, and we knew that already. I think, there was already lots of evidence that suggests, forcing people of any kind, but particularly adolescents, to do one program is probably a bad idea. So I think that's a really important takeaway. And that's not to say there might not be benefit, among, in kids and adults, and other people from these practices, but it is to say forcing them to do one particular version of it is not a good idea. And some of the comments that Willem Kuyken, the study's lead author, talk about are that, when they thought about how they were going to implement the practice, they didn't really talk in considerable detail with the kids themselves. And so, there were complaints. One complaint he gives is that, for some of the kids, this mindfulness took the place of their soccer practice. And, he tells one story about how, one mom was complaining and saying, my kid loves soccer and hates you because your mindfulness program took the place of his soccer practice. And so I think we have to be careful to say everybody ought to be doing this, when in all reality, there's probably lots of kids already doing things that are good for their mental health and well-being. And so we have to be really careful not to say you ought to be doing mindfulness when there's probably lots of other things out there that they could be doing that already are helpful. And that, I think Willoughby would agree with me that's a really critical takeaway. When we say that mindfulness or meditation programs work, they do, but they don't work better than other established therapies or even well-being approaches. So they're not better than exercise or changes in diet or other, kind of evidence-based strategies. So we can't say that everybody in a school context or work context should only be doing meditation or mindfulness. I mean, if people are doing, yoga or exercise or Sudoku puzzles or whatever, I mean, that may have the same benefits.
I actually did a study in kids that I ran. There weren't any randomized control trials in schools like back in the day. And so I was like, I'm going to do a really good study, and did a randomized control trial in a school. And my control condition was building life-size like mummies, like a sarcophagus. So it was an active, fun group activity. And we actually found huge gender effects. So so for boys, it didn't matter whether you got to build a mummy or do meditation. But for the girls, they liked the the meditation was important. So I like all the data that I ever see keeps pointing to the same thing, which is like, for some people, this could be great. For some people, it could be ineffective. And for some people, it can be harmful. And this is not a big breakthrough, by the way. This is like all therapies work that way. All of them are like that. And I just think we need to, mindfulness is not special. It's one of many possible tools. And we should treat it like we should treat any of the other tools, which is use it if it works and don't if it doesn't.
And I think to your point, or your question, Tom, I think, it's possible sort of that this particular age group was a really tricky one. Like my son's 7 and he's quite inclined to kind of do what his teachers suggest. But, I have lots of friends who have children that are teenagers, and it's a lot harder to get them to do anything they suggest as parents, but also they don't care what their teachers have to say, So I think, and that's a particularly important point that goes along with Willoughby is saying, is that, of course, there's going to be age differences. What works for 40 or 50-year-olds is not going to work for, young people of university age, and that's not going to work for teenagers, and that's not going to work for little kids. And we can't assume that we can just take the same thing and kind of slightly repackage it without talking to the individual people that want it. But also that there is that element of going, even then, even if we do everything right, it's not going to work for everyone. There are some kids who are just really going to hate it and not want to do it. And I think what's really interesting is when you look at engagement rates with kind of these practices, or you look at engagement rates with apps, meditation apps, the reality is the rates are not great. Apps love to talk about the downloads. They talk about millions or, tens of millions of downloads. But, the best data we have suggests that within 7 days of downloading it, if the company's doing really well, maybe 10 to 20% of people are still using it, right?
Yeah.
And that same data suggests that 40% of people that actually install the app don't open it. So, when they say we've got 10 million downloads, that doesn't really tell you how many people are using it. And I guess the point that I'm making, and it goes beyond apps, it doesn't really matter how effective a therapeutic approach is, or any kind of approach is, if no one will do it. If people are just not going to do it because they don't like it, or it won't work, or they don't feel like it works for them, if you can't convince them to do it, it won't be helpful.
So what are you guys advocating for? Are you talking about just doing it more safely, maybe pre-screening, better support for practitioners, teachers, or are you saying that this has been completely overblown? We need a massive wind back. It needs to be pulled out of schools and lots of other contexts where it's not really appropriate. Where are you landing on how much we need to recalibrate the use of mindfulness and meditation in societies like ours?
I mean, the Myriad study is a lesson in so many different ways. And I think one of the other things that I think is really interesting about it is probably one of the most rigorous and best designed studies, and definitely one of the largest study ever in all of, the history of the science of meditation and mindfulness. And no one's heard about it. Where's this press release? Right? It's because it didn't have the effects that it wanted. And so this is part of the problem, is that like we actually have data, like that science is chugging along. We know that meditation doesn't work for everyone. We know that that there's adverse effects. We've known this for a while, but it's not getting to the end user because of this juggernaut of, I'm sure you could speak better about that than anybody. It's media. It's like this whole, why aren't people finding out about this? Why aren't parents finding out about this? The study is publicly available. Like there was no announcement about the Myriad study. So I think that, that's one piece of the sort of problem. It's systemic on a huge level. And so, no, I think, I'm just going to restate what I said before. Like, I think that meditation and mindfulness is helpful for some people, not helpful or ineffective for some people, and harmful for some people. So I don't think it should be pulled off the shelves, because the people, it is very, very, very useful for many people. And I don't think it should be not accessible to people. I am also not a fan of screening people out. I don't think screening is where we need to be putting our attention. I think we need to be paying more attention to making, having a system, or the way that we teach meditation. And I call this a person-centered approach. But basically, the way we teach meditation is to give people an array of different practices and allow them to figure out which practice, have a system for figuring out which practice works for them, rather than like you just keep doing the same practice.
I feel like another important thing is to resources is huge. So like, why is meditation so widely touted? Yes, it's a big billion-dollar industry, but it's also seen as very, very cost effective. But that's, I think, partly because it's done without the resources that would really mitigate a lot of these harms, right? So like, someone finds it going badly, they don't have the resources. Like, again, I was very, very lucky to have the resources I did, but those were personal resources, and there's not general resources to notice when it's going badly, for those people that dig something up, to see that they are, given the proper support and everything. And so basically, and also just to have the context and the relationship to notice that, right? So a lot of every therapy works better if there's in the context of a trusting relationship and all of that. And so so basically, I feel like it's not just about sort of letting people know about this, but also, if you are going to offer these kinds of things, have the training and resources to support people when it goes badly, I guess.
I think that's a particularly big issue, which is that, and it's not going to be specific to mindfulness. I mean, there's lots of mental health awareness and destigmatization programs out there as well. And I think offering these kind of light touch approaches is easy. And it looks very good. It looks as if we're addressing the mental health crisis, the problem that is out there. It's a huge problem. The rates are going up. Suicides are going up. People are stressed. People are doing it tough. Things are hard. There aren't enough psychologists. There aren't enough psychiatrists. There aren't enough counselors. So it's really tempting to say, just download this app, or just go to this yoga class, because wouldn't that be nice? And I think that one of the common messages is, look, at worst, you'll be a bit bored, or you won't like it, And I think sort of there's this idea that, in all likelihood, it's going to be helpful. Everybody benefits from it, and the worst thing that could possibly happen is you won't like it. But what we're talking about here is the reality that for some people, it's going to do a lot of harm. And I think, we've heard that sort of, that's not all the time, and it's not everyone. But I think even more complicated is that for a lot of people, we could be wasting time. They could be doing something else. And going back to my example of, mental health awareness or destigmatization programs, of course we want people, and of course I want people to be aware if they have an issue, but I also then want them to have the resources to know how to deal with it. And so I think there's a huge issue where, if what we do is we just make people more aware that there's a problem, but we then don't allocate the necessary resources to help them deal with the problem, we may actually have made the situation worse, which is to say, prior to them undergoing our program, or prior to them learning about, mental health more generally, or feeling less stigmatized, they were maybe getting by okay, which is not a good situation. Nobody really wants that, but we also then have to invest in the necessary resources such that as we make more people aware of problems, we know where to send them, and we have people who can talk to them. So if they do try mindfulness or meditation and it really isn't working, they need to not be met with this kind of party line response of, oh, you must be doing it wrong, just do more of it. Like, nobody has that reaction. So we need people to be better informed about the fact that these things are common, and that for some people it can go really awry. We need individuals to be hearing about that, to know that. We need the media's help in that. We need clinicians to know that. We need GPs to be aware of it. We need the companies to be held to standards, truth in advertising. We need somebody to basically say to them, you cannot make exaggerated, outlandish claims about what your programs can do without good evidence. We would not allow a pharmaceutical company to make the kinds of claims that we allow some of these mindfulness and well-being organizations to make. And yet we're just letting them kind of get away with a lot of these things. And that's not to say that they can't help people, right? They absolutely can. And I think, as Willoughby said, none of this conversation is going in the direction that people shouldn't meditate. I mean, my center, the Contemplative Study Center, exists to help people learn about different types of meditation and other contemplative practices, and to figure out what they are and where they come from, and to give them an opportunity to try those things. But we need to be really careful about and specific about, well, what can these practices do? What can't they do? And really, what supports need to be in place as people go through these practices, so that when things do come up, or when the practice doesn't go well, how do we ensure that we're actually looking after people and taking care of them?
I think there's a few people here who are sort of looking back to the origins in Buddhism, potentially for solutions on how we can actually do it better in the current context we're talking about, a country like ours. So I'll just go to two of these points. Tom says, do you want to talk about how mindfulness originated in a community-minded culture in India and was taught alongside a variety of meditation techniques, including loving kindness, metta, meditation, and so on, and then consider how different it is to practice that in an individualist capitalist culture without those other complementary meditations. Another person on the meeting says, in most Buddhist traditions, mindfulness is a tool, not a treatment. With a little bit of training, a practitioner is given techniques to understand cognitive mechanisms, develop kindness and compassion. I'd love to know if Willoughby or Nick think that there might be different outcomes if this more traditional approach of using mindfulness as a tool rather than an end in itself might lead to different outcomes.
So I think that there's a lot to be learned by being informed about the history of how this practice came to be used in the modern time. So I will mention a book by David McMahon called The Making of a Buddhist Modernism. It describes kind of Buddhism's transmission to the West. And I think, one of the things that surprises a lot of people is that historically most Buddhists didn't meditate. The idea that like meditation is the centerpiece of Buddhism is a modern invention. And so this idea that like the more I meditate, I'm doing the Buddhist thing, that never happened before. And similarly, back to the Myriad study, children also didn't meditate. And so that's the idea that like, oh, children have been meditating in Asia for thousands of years, that's not true. Giving meditation to children is a completely new experiment. It might work, but it might not. So, I think that like people are ignorant when it comes to the history. And I have to throw a bone to Mind and Life that like, bringing in historians and people that actually study this and say like this, our whole idea of, what Buddhists do or, is pretty skewed through this lens of what, maybe modern Buddhism looks like in the US or in the West. So with that said, I will also say that, a lot of these different types of problems are well documented in Buddhist texts. Each of the three main schools of Buddhism actually have specific names for them. So in Zen, they're called Makyo. There's also something called Zen sickness or meditation sickness in Zen. So it's well known to cause medical like problems. In the Theravada tradition, there's a whole series of, it's called the Progress of Insight, which are known to be really difficult. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they're called nyams. So and sometimes they're part of the path and they're expected, and sometimes they require intervention and are considered problems. So I think there is something that we can learn from going back to Buddhist texts. There's actually an entire literary project that's happening right now being led by Pierce Salguaro on meditation sickness, actually going into the various texts. A lot of texts aren't actually translated into English. And so there can be a lot we can learn from ancient texts and how they dealt with meditation related problems by getting those translations out there. So that is happening. But, this is a fairly new field.
I think what I would add,
yeah, go on.
Is just in the Australian context in particular, I think that this is is important because Australia, defines itself as a secular country. And so, we don't talk about religious traditions or religious history. And so I think if we can't talk about religion or religious history, that means we're missing all of this context for how these practices were kind of originally done. We're missing sort of elements of things that they knew. Now, when I say that's by no means to say we ought to defer to them. A part of this is just basically saying one of the goals of our center is to bring these folks in to have conversations with us and to help us to understand how do they use their practices? What do they use them for? What are the goals? But of course, as we talked about earlier, there are elements of what happens in certain religious organizations that are really not helpful for a lot of people. There are things like groupthink. There are ways of approaching problems that suggest that I'm the authority, don't question me, just do as you're told. And I don't think we should be suggesting that at all here. So I think we have to be really careful. And I saw a comment as well, sort of suggesting that Buddhism is not a religion. I think we have to be really careful there, because that's a marketing technique that was employed by Buddhists as they brought it to the West. The Buddhist people were really good at selling Buddhism. And they kind of said, Buddhism is compatible with science. It's an alternative to kind of Christianity and the Abrahamic traditions, and it's scientifically compatible. In many places of the world where Buddhism is the predominant kind of belief system, it absolutely is a religion. They believe in deities, multiple deities. They believe in things that happen after you die. So it may not have the exact kind of things that we expect from a Western kind of Abrahamic religion, but there are many versions of this that are absolutely religious. So I think there is a lot to learn from these traditions. We always need to think about, I think, well, where are they coming from? What is the history? How did they do it? I think as Willoughby noted, this idea that kids ought to be doing this. I've heard monastics that I've talked to say, the only thing they ever did with young people was really cultivation practices. If anything, they really just did very brief, generation of loving kindness or compassion, and that was it. And like not until they sort of were well on or older did they ever go into any of the more complex kinds of practices that, basically we're suggesting that now everyone do. You can go on some apps and, the first thing they have you do is engage in practices that in some of these traditions, they would say, you only do that after you've been practicing for years, if not decades.
Right.
And, we're now giving these to people as their first foray into meditation. So I think there is something to be learned from that discussion and dialogue, but I think we do have to be careful not to necessarily be deferent. Which is to say, it's a conversation we can learn from each other, but we still have to think about evidence. We still have to think about, well, what is best practice at the end of the day? How do we help people and minimize the harm that we might be doing?
Okay, let's get to some more of our questions before we run out of time. Avril says, I hear you use meditation, mindfulness, and awareness interchangeably as distinct elements and practices. Do you think there's a fuzziness here that impacts the management of each of these separate practices?
I'm happy to talk about that if Willoughby doesn't mind, because I feel like this is one of my biggest bugbears. And I've written quite extensively about this. I think this is absolutely a huge problem. And, I've written an article that sort of suggests, a popular article that people can read about how nobody knows what mindfulness is. And that's a problem. I think that's actually the title of the article. And one of the, among many points that I make sort of is, if these things can be whatever you want them to be, if mindfulness is coloring in, if it's meditation, and by meditation, if it's TM, if it's 10-day Goenka retreats, if it's just looking at your thoughts, if it's sitting and putting your thoughts on a cloud and letting them float away, if it's creating a mental garden, then there's no way for us to actually say this is what works. And there's no way for us to say this is who you ought to go to learn this, because we have this sense of, well, it's whatever you want it to be. And if it's whatever you want it to be, then anybody can provide it. So whereas I think if we make clear that meditation is one broad set of practices, mindfulness is sort of another idea and possibly set of practices, awareness is a whole other set of practices, and these things do have some overlap, but they're not interchangeable. And we also recognize that, well, when we talk about the evidence we do have, one of the things we haven't talked about today, although Willoughby and I bang on about this all the time, is that most of what we know is about what we call mindfulness-based programs. So these are very specific 8-week structured programs that are delivered in a very specific way. It's kind of analogous to cognitive behavioral therapy, right? When we start to go outside of that, the scientific evidence that we have dwindles massively. right? So that's what we know the most. We know the most about if you do these particular types of 8-week programs, you're probably on average going to benefit by about 50%. It's a coin toss. But when we start to kind of change that and we make it our own, which is happening all the time, companies go, mindfulness works. And when they say mindfulness works, they're talking about that structured program, right? But then they say, and because it works, use our mindfulness app or buy our mindfulness coloring in book, and you'll have wonderful benefits. And so it's this kind of marketing play where it's using the science that we know about one version of the offering of the program. And you go, oh, wow, that's amazing. It's scientific. But then what you don't realize is that the thing they're offering you doesn't look anything like that. And frankly, has probably not been studied at all.
I heard a really great analogy once. Someone said, it's like someone saying like, a Maserati is a car. A Maserati goes 240 miles an hour. I have a car. And let people fill in the the next thing. And mindfulness is exactly like that. I mean, I did a study where, it was like this 8-week program. We had 12 people per class. We had people who were like monastically trained, like 20 years plus of meditation experience, plus a clinical degree. Those were our teachers, like superstar teachers. And, that gets lumped as mindfulness training. And then somebody says, oh, I have this mindfulness training. And it's not at all like the same thing. You can't, it's called horizontal data borrowing. You cannot like borrow my data. You cannot borrow my evidence for your app because they're completely different. Just because they have the same word, mindfulness, does not mean that they're the same. And so, mindfulness is not mindfulness is not mindfulness.
Yeah, so that's ties into another question we've got here. It seems the community at large, including clinicians, are being tricked into thinking mindfulness, or however they're defining it, I guess, is always harmless. How do we bust this myth? Do we need more government funding for research, science communicators, dissemination, support for mediators, or what else should we do?
That's a great question. I mean, that we're doing it right now. We're doing a public event, trying to raise awareness about this issue. And I mean, this is also a well-known problem called the science to service gap. So there can be scientific discoveries, but they take an average of 17 years to get to the end user and benefit patients. So we're trying to speed up that gap to try to say that, that we already have the data. I've been doing this research for, more than a decade now. So we already have information that the public needs to know. And, this is a communications dissemination issue.
I agree. It's also a research issue. And I think it's one where, and I think partially it sort of has a bit to do with the time that we're in, which is to say, people are impatient. We are impatient. Countries are impatient. We particularly in the context of, COVID, we've had increasing issues with mental health. And so governments want to give something to their people now so that they can get reelected. And so I think that, what Willoughby mentioned about the 17 years, I think the problem is if we go, oh, we've got a little bit of a pilot study here that suggests that this thing might work. We've done it with 50 people, and then we just roll it out nationwide. We're skipping through all the stages that we know is best practice in how we study things. So we try things out, in a very small setting. We then try it out more rigorously. We then try it out even more rigorously, and we compare it against a control. We know one thing that's really critical is we know that the kind of versions of any kind of intervention, therapy, treatment approach that we test in our labs probably won't look anything like, or very little like, what will happen when it gets into the hands of clinicians in the real world. So there's a drop in how well it'll work once it's out in the world, because people start to do their own thing. Right? They make tweaks, they make changes, they change their prescribing practices. And so we have to study that and understand that as well, because we need to reliably know ahead of time, what is that going to look like? So if we know it works approximately, so well in our university labs or our research centers, how big is that drop in how well it will work? Are there new risks or adverse events or harmful effects that come up once the non-rigorous, non-university, non-research-based folks start delivering it? Maybe they don't understand it, and maybe we've written our kind of manuals or instructions badly. And so I think what does often happen, I think, in the research space is there's a sense of, oh, we've answered all those questions. we already know mindfulness works. Like, what else do we need to do? We don't need any more research. It works, right? Like, lots of people benefit from it. We've been studying this for, for decades. Well, I mean, we haven't actually, relative to most other things in medicine, we've not been studying this for very long. And as much as we have the data that Willoughby's talking about, we need a lot more of it.
Well, and I should also say that the data, if you look at all those many studies that we've done, only 1% of them even measured adverse effects. So the amount of information that we have is pretty pathetic. And it's probably also only been the last 5 years and mostly my lab that's done it. So we definitely need more people for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something from my actual professional hat on. So one of the things I study is like information systems and misinformation and how that travels about. And I suspect actually that, so yeah, as Willoughby said, part of what we're doing, this is it, is getting the word out. But I suspect, so these are nonlinear systems, which means that I think right now, there's not nearly as much of a narrative as there should be about the adverse effects because there's a stigma about having an adverse effect, right? It means you did something wrong. And I think there's, though, a virtuous cycle that we can get to pretty soon by, as enough people realize that that stigma is there and that it's wrong, then more people are willing to share, and those more people are willing to share. And so I feel like, yeah, this is not a thing that might take decades to get out, but we just have to sort of basically break that sort of stigma enough that people feel comfortable sharing. And then I think we'll hear a lot more and it will become more widely known because of that.
I'd love for governments to step in and sort of regulate these kinds of products and offerings. I'm also quite pragmatic and know that that's really hard. And I think there's a role for employers and people that are offering these programs and professional bodies, the organizations that kind of oversee GPs and psychologists, that they could play in this, which is to say, companies often kind of offer mindfulness meditation or other wellness programs to their employees. And, there's a potential risk and liability there for them that they need to know about, right? I mean, if they're offering these things and their employees are potentially harmed by them, there's a real risk there. And similarly, sort of, GPs are recommending these things. And so I think there are ways in which, figuring out how to get this information into the hands of the right people will expedite the cycle that Andy is talking about, getting the information out more widely. But there has to be some real effort here to do that. And I guess we're working against an industry, as Willoughby had mentioned earlier, for whom it's bad business. For them, it's in their best interest to just say, actually, you need more of us. What you need is to do more of our thing, buy more of our product, come to church more, and that'll fix the problem. They don't want to say, stop using our product, go somewhere else. It's bad business. So we're going to need other people to step in and be prepared to call them out a bit and put them in the hot seat and say, if you don't acknowledge this, there will be consequences, because otherwise they'll just keep doing it.
We've got another question from one of our participants in the meeting. Is dissociation with oneself always considered bad, or can it be helpful? And that question really took me back to your story, Andy, where it sounds like you went through some very tumultuous months there, but in some ways this maybe led you to a place you needed to go. And if it had been managed in a more careful, considered way, it actually could have been a really positive thing.
Yeah, so this is a good question. And I feel like, there's two answers to it. One is, I had mild dissociation starting from childhood as a coping mechanism. And I think it was helpful then. That was what I needed to do to get through things because I didn't have any other resources. And even after, and I think, I am now in a much better place than I was even before I was meditating. And a lot of it is because of dealing with a lot of the stuff that it brought up. And so in that sense, it was good. But it was good not because of the meditation, but because of all this stuff I did afterwards, like the years and years of therapy and the, all the resources of managing that. And if I had not had those, I think it's very, very likely, either I wouldn't be here or I'd have lost my job, lost my family. Like it was, I was kind of on a precipice there. And it was because of those resources and everything to deal with the loss of my coping mechanism that I got there. So it was good. I think that, again, I'm sort of happy where I am now, and I'm very glad I dealt with all that. But the dissociation, the early dissociation, was a very needed coping mechanism because I didn't have the resources. And yeah, I don't know if that's an answer, but I feel like, yeah.
I mean, it's a really great question. I actually teach an entire class on this question called Me, Myself, and I. So dissociation is, I call it a capacity that we have. It's a thing that we can do. And it's a highly contested state. Like, there are a lot of different cultures value certain types of dissociative experiences under certain conditions. So trance states, all different kinds of states. And there are other cultures, a lot of Western cultures, that have labeled it as a pathological state. It's considered a disorder. And so, and I don't think we should, say, well, we shouldn't do that. Like, I think people need to be honored as to what culture they're in. So if you're in a Western culture, you're still allowed to say, I don't like this state. But just to say that it's a complicated question, and that this question applies to all of the meditation related experiences that we're talking about. And that, like, every single one, somewhere, that is a valued experience. So even intense terror is actually a known state of the progress of insight. And so for some Theravada Buddhists, that might be considered progress on the meditative path. For most people, it's like, no way, do I want this ever to happen again? But I think that's another piece that's very, very confusing, which is that a lot of different experiences are contested. And it's not entirely clear who gets to decide whether this is a problem or not. And so that question, who gets to decide whether this is a problem or not, is a question of power and authority. Who has the power and authority to make that decision? I happen to be sort of a victim advocate, and I think that the person who's having the experience gets to make that decision. That is not always everyone's answer. So I want to say it's that question is like, an entire semester's worth of download. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you for all your questions. There's so many interesting questions there that we haven't had time to get to, but just shows how engaged you guys have been in this conversation. And, there's just so much more to talk about, so much more research, as you guys have pointed out. So much of a rethink in the way we've rolled out this practice in a modern context that just hasn't been properly considered. So thank you so much to Nicholas, Willoughby, and Andy for participating in this conversation. And thank you for being part of it and submitting your questions. If you want to stay in touch and ask further questions or make any other contribution or contact, get in touch with the Contemplative Studies Centre. There's an email, contemplate-csc@unimelb.edu.au. We can put that in the thread as well. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation.